The dare was Pressy's idea, which meant that when it went wrong, or more precisely, when it went in a direction none of them had planned for, Pressy was the one who had to live with it. Not that it went badly, that was the part nobody could have predicted. The human worked the morning shift at the transit documentation office on level 12 of the concourse, which was where all arriving and departing passengers had to file clearance forms, and which was therefore one of the most visited locations on Verath Station and also, by unanimous agreement of every species that passed through it, one of the most tedious. The forms were long. The queue was always longer. The staff were understaffed in the specific way that bureaucratic operations everywhere in the known galaxy tended to be understaffed, which was chronically and without apparent prospect of improvement. The human's name, according to the staff panel beside his window, was Thomas Adami Park. He was listed as Senior Documentation Specialist, which was the kind of title that sounded important and meant he had survived long enough in the position to be given responsibility for training new staff, which in practice meant he trained new staff and received no additional compensation for doing so. He was 46 years old, originally from Toronto. With reading glasses he pushed up his nose every few minutes, and a mug on his desk that said something in English that the translation panel in the waiting area rendered as "I would rather be anywhere else," which Pressy thought was either very honest or very funny or possibly both. He had been working the morning shift at Window 4 for 3 years. The dare was simple. Pressy would go sit beside him for 5 minutes. Not in the queue, the documentation staff had a small break area behind the main counter, 3 chairs and a low table, visible from the waiting area through the gap where the counter ended. She would go back there and sit in one of the chairs beside the human and see what happened. This was a dare because of what everyone on Verath Station knew about the humans in general, and Thomas Adami Park in particular. Pressy was Lethani, 23 years old, second-year cultural exchange student at the Verath Institute of Interspecies Studies, which meant she spent her days studying the intersection of alien cultures and her evenings arguing with her cohort about what those intersections meant, and her free time on dares that she later had to explain to her academic advisor. The Lethani were, by the general consensus of most species that interacted with them, an extremely social people. They communicated through a combination of verbal language and a bioluminescent display system located in thin lines along their forearms and collarbones that shifted color and pattern with emotional state, involuntarily, which meant that every Lethani was, at all times, broadcasting exactly how they felt to anyone who knew how to read the signals. There was no Lethani word for a poker face. The concept was physiologically impossible. Her cohort at the institute was 8 students from 6 species, and they had been together for 7 months. And in the way of students, everywhere they had developed opinions about the station around them. Their opinion about the humans on Verath Station had been developing since orientation week, when the cohort advisor, a Tethani woman with 19 years of interspecies education experience, had said something that none of them had fully understood at the time. She had said, "The humans on this station will teach you more about interspecies dynamics than any lecture I give you, but only if you pay attention to the right things." They had asked what the right things were. She had smiled, which for a Tethani was a rare and specific expression, and said, "That is what you are here to find out." The cohort had been finding it out for 7 months. What they had found in those 7 months was confusing. The humans on Verath Station were strange was the word that kept arriving, though none of them could fully justify it. Not strange in the ways the orientation materials had suggested. The orientation materials described humans as an emotionally expressive species, high social bonding tendency, strong in-group loyalty, aggressive when threatened. These things were true as far as it went. But there were things the orientation materials had not mentioned. The way the human who worked the sanitation rounds on level 8 stopped every morning at the viewport, and looked at the gas giant below the station for exactly 4 minutes before starting his shift. And the expression on his face during those 4 minutes was something none of them had a word for. The way the human doctor in the medical bay had a photograph on her desk, not a screen, a physical printed photograph, a technology that most species had abandoned 300 years ago of two people standing in front of a large body of water, and the way she touched the corner of it sometimes when she was writing reports, without seeming to notice she was doing it. The way Thomas Adami Park, senior documentation specialist, Window 4, spent the first 10 minutes of every morning shift arranging his desk in a specific order. Mug on the left, forms in 3 precise stacks, glasses case at a specific angle, and did this with the same careful attention whether the queue was empty or stretched to the door. They had been watching him for 2 months. Not in a strange way, the waiting area for documentation was public, and most of the cohort had legitimate forms to file, and filing forms gave you time to observe. They had watched him handle 300 forms a week with consistent attention. They had watched him explain a complicated multi-species transit regulation to a Garrel family, slowly and carefully twice, in 2 different framings until the family understood. They had watched him eat his lunch at his desk every day, reading something on his personal tablet, and refill his mug from a thermos exactly 3 times per shift. They had discussed what they were observing extensively. They had not reached a conclusion. Hence the dare. Pressy stood at the end of the counter for a moment before going around. The counter area behind window 4 was small. Thomas Adami Park was at his window processing a form for a Velun traveler. He had not yet noticed her, or if he had, he gave no indication. She went around the end of the counter. She sat down in one of the 3 chairs in the break area. She looked at her communicator as if she had a reason to be there, though she was aware this was not convincing because she did not have a convincing reason to be there. The bioluminescence on her forearms, which she could not control, was doing something complicated. The rapid flicker pattern that meant anticipatory anxiety, overlaid with the slower pulse of genuine curiosity. Anyone who could read Lethani signals would have an accurate picture of her internal state. Thomas Adami Park finished the Velun traveler's form. He turned from the window, he saw her. He looked at her for a moment. She looked at him. He was a medium-height human with reading glasses on a cord around his neck and ink on 2 of his left fingers, and the general aspect of a person who had long since reached a settled understanding of himself and his place in things. "Are you lost?" he said, not unkindly, as if this were a reasonable possibility. "No," she said. I'm a student at the Institute. I'm studying interspecies dynamics and she stopped, started again. The honest version was usually the one that worked. My cohort dared me to come sit here for 5 minutes. He looked at her. He looked at the waiting area, where she was fairly certain several members of her cohort were visible in various states of pretending not to watch. "I see," he said. "I can go," she said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, it's not meant to be. We've been observing the station as part of our coursework and—" "How long have you been watching?" he said, not with suspicion, with something more like curiosity. 2 months, she said honestly. And then, because she had started being honest and it seemed wrong to stop, we've been trying to understand something and we can't figure it out. He sat down in one of the other chairs. The break area held 3 chairs. He took the one across from her rather than the one beside her, which gave them a space between them that felt appropriate and was probably deliberate. He put his mug on the table. "What have you been trying to figure out?" he said. She looked at her hands. The bioluminescence had settled somewhat, the anxiety pattern quieting into plain curiosity, which was easier to be in. "The way you arrange your desk," she said. "Every morning, we've been trying to understand what it means." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his desk through the window gap. "It's the same every day," she continued. We thought at first it was procedural, that the forms needed to be in a specific order for the work. But the order changes sometimes based on what's coming in that day, which means it's not the same for procedural reasons. And then we thought it might be a cultural ritual. Humans have a significant ritual practice across most cultures. But we couldn't find a corresponding entry in any documentation about human desk organization as ritual. She paused. We've been discussing it for 2 months, and we have 4 different theories, and none of them feel right. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What are the 4 theories?" She blinked. She had expected him to be amused or dismissive or to answer immediately. She had not expected the question. Prelli, one of my cohort, thinks it's a form of control management. That when the work feels unpredictable, the desk arrangement is the thing you can control, so it feels a stabilizing. That's not wrong, he said. Austin thinks it's memory-related, that humans encode their daily intentions into physical objects, and the arrangement is how you set the day's intentions. Also not entirely wrong, he said. What are the other 2? Death thinks it's habit without meaning, that you do it because you've always done it and the meaning has been consumed by the repetition. That's the most cynical interpretation, he said, not critically. Death is from a species that doesn't have strong ritual practice, she said. He's suspicious of repetition in general. She paused. The 4th theory is mine. Tell me. I think, she said slowly, that you do it because it's yours. Because in a job that processes several hundred strangers every week and a station with 47 species and 11,000 people, the desk is the 1 square meter of the station that belongs specifically to you and that you have specific authority over. And arranging it is how you say, "This is mine. I am here. This is what I am doing today." He was very still. That's the closest, he said quietly. The bioluminescence on her arms shifted, the pattern that meant she had understood something she had been reaching for. She couldn't help it. She never could. What does that mean? He said. He was looking at her arms. Not intrusively, with the same quality of attention he had given the Garrel family explaining the transit regulation. Genuine. I understood something, she said. The pattern is involuntary. I can't control what it displays. It responds directly to my internal state. I'm sorry if it's. Don't apologize, he said. I've worked here 3 years and I've never been able to read Lethani signals. I've looked up the documentation twice, but the practical reading is harder than the description. He looked at her arms, openly curious. What does that one mean, the one it's doing now? She looked down at herself. The slow, warm gold that was currently moving along her forearms, she knew, was the pattern associated with the specific feeling of understanding clicking into place, not excitement, something quieter. The Lethani called it Thesson. There was no galactic standard translation that she had ever found fully satisfying. There is a feeling we have, she said. When you have been trying to understand something for a long time and then you do, it is not the same as being happy. It is more specific than that, like a puzzle fitting. We have a word for it, Thesson. This is what Thesson looks like. He looked at the pattern on her arms. We have something like that, he said. We call it the click when something clicks. He considered. The English word is limited. It doesn't describe the feeling as precisely as yours does. Most translation loses precision, she said. Yes, he said, that's most of the problem actually, most of the problem in interspecies documentation work. He picked up his mug. The forms are designed to transfer information across species, but information is not meaning. The form tells me that a Voss family is traveling with 3 members under dependent age. It doesn't tell me that the reason they're traveling is that the grandmother is dying and they have 6 days to reach her. The form is accurate. The form is also missing everything that matters. Oh, she looked at him. How do you know about the grandmother? She said. Because I asked, he said. I don't ask everyone. But sometimes you can tell when the form is not the whole story, and sometimes asking is, sometimes it matters that someone asked. Does it change what you do with the form? Not the processing, he said. The form gets processed the same way regardless. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes I can flag a connection to the medical liaison, or I can move a family through faster so they have more time, or I can just, he stopped. Sometimes I can just say, I understand why you're in a hurry. That is also information for them. Oh, she sat with that. You have been doing this for 3 years, she said. 3 years and 4 months, he said. Do you like it? He considered this in the honest way she was coming to recognize as specific to him. I like the work, he said. I am less enthusiastic about the forms themselves, which are poorly designed and have been for the entire time I've been here and will probably continue to be. I have filed 7 improvement recommendations. 3 were acknowledged, 0 were implemented. Well, that sounds frustrating. It is, he said. I've made my peace with the frustration. He looked at his mug. The mug helps. She looked at the mug. I would rather be anywhere else. Is that true, she said. Would you rather be anywhere else? He smiled. She had seen humans smile many times. It was one of the features the orientation materials covered thoroughly, the social signaling function of the human facial expression system. But she had not, she realized, been close enough to need to see the specific variations. This smile was not the one from the documentation. It was smaller and more tired and contained something inside it that she did not have a word for. No, he said, that's why it's funny. The 5 minutes were up. She knew this because her communicator would have sent a soft signal, but she had not felt it because she had not been watching the time. She did not move. Can I ask you something else? She said. You can ask me anything, he said. I'm on break for another 8 minutes. She came back the next day. Not on a dare. Pressy had no need for dares in this direction. She had texted her cohort in the waiting area with a single message that said this is different than we thought and left them to interpret it, which they had done with considerable energy for the remainder of the afternoon. She came back because she had told Thomas she was studying interspecies dynamics, and he had said, with the directness she was coming to find clarifying, you should take notes then, not on me specifically, on what happens at window 4 in a given morning. The documentation work is a lens, everything comes through it. Also, she had taken notes. She had sat in the waiting area for 4 hours that afternoon and the following morning with her study tablet, and she had watched window 4 with the specific attention the Institute trained her to use, looking for patterns, for the moments of friction and resolution, for the places where the form diverged from the human truth of the situation. She had seen a Garrel mother with 4 children traveling alone, whose paperwork was missing a required signature from a co-guardian she no longer had. She had watched Thomas work through 3 different alternative documentation pathways until he found one that satisfied the requirement and allowed the family to proceed. The mother had not thanked him. She was too tired to thank him. She had taken the forms and gathered her children and left. Thomas had turned back to his desk and made a note in his log and called the next person. She had seen an elderly Senari man whose transit permit had a clerical error that made it technically invalid. The error was minor and obvious and clearly not the man's fault. The error also, under strict interpretation of the regulations, required a full reapplication that would take 6 days. She had watched Thomas look at the permit for a long moment and then look at the elderly man and then access a secondary documentation pathway that she had not known existed, and that from his brief explanation to the man appeared to be a provision for clerical error correction that bypassed the reapplication process. He had had to make 3 calls to verify it was applicable. The whole thing took 40 minutes. The queue had backed up. Thomas had worked through the backup with the same pace he always maintained, unhurried, without apology for the wait. She had seen a young Voss couple whose paperwork was perfect, and whose transit was completely routine, and who Thomas had processed in under 4 minutes. but during those 4 minutes had said something to them that made the female of the pair make a sound that the translation panel identified as laughter. She had written 6 pages of notes. She brought them to Thomas the next morning on his break. He read them. She had not expected him to actually read them. She had thought she would describe what she had observed and ask for his perspective. He read them carefully, in the way he read his personal tablet at lunch, with the same quality of attention he gave the forms. When he finished, he put the tablet down and said, "The Voss couple, you wrote that you couldn't identify what I said that made her laugh." "The translation panel didn't catch it," she said. "It was too quiet." "I told them the forms they'd completed were the neatest forms I'd processed that week," he said, which was true. "And I told them that in my experience, people who complete forms neatly tend to be people who pay attention to things that matter, and that I hoped their transit went well." She looked at him. Is that a true thing to say, about neat forms and paying attention?" "I don't know," he said, "probably not universally, but it seemed true about them, and it was a reason to say something kind that wasn't empty." He paused. "There is a human concept, small talk, conversation with no informational content performed as social bonding. I am not very good at small talk. I prefer to say something true and specific. It takes longer to find, but it lands differently." It made her laugh, Pressy said. "Yes," he said, "sometimes a true and specific thing is also funny. That's a good day." She was writing. She had started writing automatically without deciding to. "You can ask me things directly," he said. "You don't have to observe from the waiting area if you have specific questions." "The observation is part of the method," she said. "If I as you what you do, you tell me what you think you do. If I watch you do it, I see what you actually do. They're not always the same." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good method," he said. "It's the Institute's method," she said, "but I think it's a good one." "What's the discrepancy," he said, "between what I think I do and what I actually do?" She looked at her notes. "You think you process forms," she said. "What you actually do is find the pathway that lets the person in front of you get to where they need to be. The forms are the mechanism. The pathway is the work." He looked at her with an expression she was getting better at reading, not the smile from the documentation, not the smaller, tired one she had seen on the first day. Something more open than either. 3 years," he said. "Nobody has said it that way before." "Has anyone watched for 4 hours and written 6 pages before?" she said. "Not that I'm aware of," he said. The bioluminescence on her arms was doing the Thesson pattern again. She had stopped apologizing for it. She told her cohort about the conversations. She told them with more precision than she usually brought to cohort discussions, because she wanted them to understand what she was understanding. Death, who was suspicious of repetition, said, "He sounds like someone who has made the best of a situation that doesn't deserve the quality of attention he's giving it." Austin, who thought the desk arrangement was memory-related, said, "He sounds like someone who has found a way to make every small transaction matter." Prelli, who had the control management theory, said, "He sounds lonely." Pressy thought about all three of these. She thought they were all partially true and all partially missing something. She was thinking about it one evening in the cohort common room when their advisor, the Tethani woman with 19 years of experience, came in for what she called a pastoral visit and what the cohort called an intelligence-gathering operation. She sat down and looked at Pressy in the specific way that meant she had already been given a summary by someone. "The documentation specialist at window 4, she said. "Oh yes," Pressy said. "Tell me what you've found." Pressy thought about how to say it precisely. "The work he does is not the work he appears to be doing," she said. "The apparent work is form processing. The actual work is holding a space where 11 species a day can get from where they are to where they need to be and making sure the mechanism doesn't fail them. She paused. He has 7 declined improvement recommendations on file. The forms are badly designed. The system is understaffed. The regulations are inconsistent between species. He works within all of these constraints every day, and he finds the pathways anyway. The advisor was quiet for a moment. "And what does this tell you about interspecies dynamics?" she said. It was not a prompt so much as a genuine question, which was the way she asked things. "It tells me," Pressy said slowly, "that the most significant interspecies interactions on this station are not the ones in the diplomatic quarter or the research collaborations or the cultural exchange programs. They're at window 4 every morning when someone needs a pathway and the system doesn't have a clear one, and there's a human with reading glasses who has spent 3 years learning every undocumented provision in a regulatory framework that was never designed for the species it serves." She stopped. "It tells me that the infrastructure of interspecies life is held together by people who decided to understand it well enough to make it work for everyone who comes through." The advisor looked at her for a long time. "Write that up," she said, "as a paper." "It's not," Pressy started. "It's a case study of one documentation specialist. It's a case study of the mechanism by which interspecies cohabitation actually functions," the advisor said. "The gap between formal interspecies framework and lived interspecies experience is one of the central questions of this field. You found a window into it. Literally," she stood, "write the paper. I want a draft in 3 weeks." Oh, she left. Pressy sat with the instruction for a moment. Then she opened her notes and started writing. She went back to window for the next morning to tell Thomas about the paper. He was arranging his desk when she arrived, mug left, forms in 3 stacks, glasses case angled, and he looked up when she came around the counter and sat in her chair, which she had started thinking of as her chair, which was probably presumptuous. She told him about the paper. She told him honestly, which she had found was the only register that worked between them. He listened. He made a small adjustment to one of the form stacks. "What's the central argument?" he said. "That the formal interspecies framework is insufficient on its own, and that what makes it function is the layer of human, of individual interpretation and relationship building that happens in the gaps." She paused. "I'm using human in the species-specific sense. I'm arguing that Thomas Adami Park is the case study, not that humans in general are the variable." "I might be a bad case study," he said. "I'm one person, I could be anomalous." "You're one person in a job where the turnover rate is extremely high," she said. "The average tenure in documentation specialist roles on stations of this size is 11 months. You've been here 3 years and 4 months. That's not anomalous, that's a choice." She looked at him. "Why have you stayed?" He was quiet for a moment, with the quality of quiet she had come to recognize as honest consideration rather than delay. "Because I know the system," he said. 3 years and 4 months of this specific system, these regulations, these forms, these undocumented provisions. Every month I'm here, I find a new pathway I didn't know about before. And every time I find a new pathway, someone who needed it eventually comes through the queue and I can use it." He looked at his desk. "If I leave, the person who comes after me starts from zero. The pathways take time to find." Oh, she looked at him. "You stay because leaving would waste the knowledge," she said. "That's part of it," he said, "also the mug." She had been expecting something more. She had not been expecting the mug. "Oh, the mug," she said. "My daughter gave me the mug," he said. "Before I took this posting, she was 14, she thought it was funny, she was right." He touched the handle. "She is 18 now, she is studying materials engineering at a university in Seoul. She sends me messages 3 times a week and I send her messages 3 times a week, and sometimes we talk about her coursework and sometimes we talk about what I saw at the window that day." He looked at the mug. "She has never met an alien." I send her things from the window, and she tells me what they make her think about. It is, it has become one of the better parts of the job. The bioluminescence on Pressy's arms shifted in a way she recognized before she could name it, a slow, warm pattern that was not Thesson this time. Something broader than understanding. Something more like the feeling of seeing a whole shape you had only had pieces of before. What does that look like? Thomas said. He had started asking, she had started telling him. There is a Lethani concept, she said. We don't have a single word for it. We have a phrase, velanthosoren. It means the moment when the scattered things become a picture. She looked at her arms. This is that. Well, the scattered things, he said. The mug, she said, your daughter, the Voss couple and the neat forms, the Senari man and the 40 minutes. 7 declined recommendations, 3 years and 4 months. She looked at him. The reason you stay is not one reason, it is all of them, and they make a picture. He was very still. Oh yes, he said, that's right. Humans are not usually described this way, she said. In the orientation materials, they are described as, I don't mean this negatively, as practical, goal-oriented, focused on outcome. Well, some of us are, he said. You are also practical and goal-oriented, she said. But the goal is not what the orientation materials suggest. The orientation materials describe human goals as advancement, resource acquisition, social status. She paused. Your goal is to make sure the system works for everyone who comes through it. That is not in the orientation materials. No, he said. Well, why not? He thought about this. The queue was beginning to build at his window, the morning rush was starting, the flow of Verath station's daily life pressing through the documentation requirement. Because it's not dramatic enough, he said, the orientation materials are trying to describe a species. Dramatic generalization is necessary for description, but the actual thing is it's always more specific and more ordinary than the description. He stood up, he put on his glasses, he turned to look at the queue beginning at his window. The ordinary is not interesting to describe, but it's where most people actually live. He went back to his window. She watched him work for an hour before she left to go to her morning lecture. She watched him process an Orion Transit application with a complicated multi-visa requirement. She watched him help a Geralt child who had been separated from her parents find the right terminal to reach them. She watched him take his first thermos refill at exactly the time she had noted in her observations. She wrote 4 more pages of notes. The paper took 5 weeks, not 3. The advisor did not complain about the delay. She read the draft and sent it back with extensive notes in the margins, which was the Tethani equivalent of saying that the core argument was strong and the evidence needed sharpening, which was the most positive feed. Back she gave. Pressy sharpened the evidence. She went back to window for 6 more times. She conducted formal observation sessions and informal conversations, which had by now become a thing that Thomas Adami Park had apparently made room for in his mornings in the same way he made room for his thermos refills, not scheduled, but expected, part of the rhythm. She brought him, on the 4th return visit, a text on Lethani bioluminescent communication that she had written for a first-year seminar. She left it on the break table with a note that said, "So you can read the signals, more accurate than the documentation." He read it overnight, and the next morning he said, "The signal you were showing when I told you about my daughter." "Velanthosoren," she said. "The scattered things becoming a picture," he said. "Yes, I understand that one now." "You have an equivalent," she said. "You've described it before without the word." Well, he thought about it. "Perspective," he said, "when things finally make sense in context." He considered, "It's a weaker word. It doesn't have the visual quality yours has, the sense of things assembling." "Borrow mine," she said. Well, he looked at her. "Languages should borrow from each other," she said. "That's what my advisor says. that when a concept exists in one language without a good equivalent in another, the correct response is not approximation, it's adoption. Velantha Soren, he said. His accent was imprecise, English phonemes reshaping the Lethani sounds in ways that made it distinctly his, but the intent was clear. Close enough, she said. The paper was submitted 8 weeks after the dare. It was titled The Documentation Window as Interspecies Interface, a case study in informal gap bridging in multi-species transit infrastructure. The abstract described its subject as an examination of the mechanisms by which formal interspecies regulatory frameworks are made functional through individual acts of sustained attention, accumulated expertise, and what this paper argues is best understood as vocational loyalty, the commitment to a role not because of its status or rewards, but because the accumulated knowledge within it is irreplaceable and the people who need it are always arriving. The case study subject was listed as Thomas Adami Park, Senior Documentation Specialist, Window 4, Level 12, Verath Station. 3 years, 7 months in role. The paper received the highest mark in the cohort's year. The advisor sent it to the Journal of Applied Interspecies Dynamics. It was accepted for publication 4 months later. Pressy told Thomas about the acceptance on a Tuesday morning. She came around the counter and sat in her chair and told him. He was quiet for a moment. You listed me by name, he said. With your permission, she said, which you gave when I asked in week 6. I remember, he said, he picked up his mug. My daughter will read this. I sent her a copy already, Pressy said, through the contact information you gave me. He looked at her. She sent me a message, he said. Last night, she said, he stopped. His voice had changed in a way she recognized from the documentation on human emotional response, the specific acoustic shift associated with a feeling running too large for the container of the sentence. She said she finally understood why I stayed. The bioluminescence on Pressy's arms was doing something she had not seen it do before. She looked at it, gold but deeper than Thesson, and with a quality of steadiness that felt different from the assembling pattern. Something that had assembled and then settled. Something that was simply present. She did not have a word for it, she would think about what to call it. She would ask Thomas. She had learned that when she was looking for the right word for something, it helped to have a conversation about it. He was good at finding words for things she could not quite name. I should file this formally, she said, the publication for the station record. That would go through documentation, he said. Yes, she said, I'll need a form. He smiled, the tired small one that had something inside it. She could read it now, she had read enough of them to know that what it contained was not sadness, as she had initially assessed, but something more like a long and considered peace with where he was. Window 4, he said, when you're ready. She stood up, she straightened her jacket. The bioluminescence along her arms and collarbones was still doing the thing she did not have a word for, steady and warm, the color of something settled. She went around the counter, she joined the queue, she waited for window 4. 6 months later, when her exchange year ended and she prepared to return to Lethani space to complete her degree, she went to say goodbye. She had thought about this. She had thought about what to bring, what to say, how to say it across the species gap that her year on V. Urath Station had taught her was both real and smaller than the orientation materials suggested. She brought him a Lethani text on the physiology of bioluminescent communication, not the first-year seminar one, but the comprehensive research edition, which contained documentation on 47 patterns and their associated internal states, including several that had no galactic standard equivalent. He had asked her in month 3 whether the pattern she showed sometimes when they were talking, the one she still had not named, was in the reference texts. It was not in the first-year seminar text. It was in this one, She had found it in week 11 under the classification for states that arose specifically from sustained cross-species connection. The Lethani word for it was long and she had practiced it. She set the book on the break table. She put a note inside the front cover with the Lethani word and its description, which the researchers had defined as the state of bioluminescent stability that arises when an individual has found, in another person of a different species, a point of genuine recognition, not sameness but resonance. The light that means, you are different from me and I understand you anyway, and this is one of the better things. Below the definition, she had written, in English that she had looked up very carefully, window 4, 3 years, 8 months, one of the better things. He read the note. He was quiet for long enough that she watched him carefully, reading all the signals she now had vocabulary for. The expression on his face was not in the orientation materials. She thought she knew what it was anyway. Safe travels, he said. I'll send the second paper, she said. When it's done, it's going to be about the bioluminescent pattern I kept showing that I didn't have a word for. You found the word, he said. You'll have the reference text now, she said. You can look it up. She picked up her bag. I annotated the page. She left. She did not look back because the Lethani considered looking back in departure to be an expression of doubt, a signal that you were not certain you were doing the right thing. She was certain. She had been certain since she found the word. The bioluminescence along her arms and collarbones was steady and warm all the way to the departure gate. It was still doing it when she boarded the transit ship. She let it. Thank you for sitting with this one. I know it's quieter than some. No crisis, no countdown, no red lights. Just a student who dared herself to sit beside a stranger for 5 minutes and stayed for a year and left with a word she'd been looking for. That's the story, that's all of it, and somehow that's everything. If you felt something in the last few lines that you couldn't immediately name, I think you know what the Lethani would call it. Subscribe if you want more. Leave a comment. Tell me which moment you'll carry with you. Until next time, find your window 4. Stay longer than you planned.